Hello, everyone. This is Professor DePaulo welcoming you back to Psych 260 Abnormal Psychology. And this week we're going to be talking about eating disorders, which is chapter 11 of the text. So, eating disorders are a very severe problem and pervasive problem, especially in this country, in the Western societies. And the problem with eating disorders is there's not really one effective treatment. For the mood disorders, we had effective treatments, we had medication, we also had behavioral treatments. For somatization, not so much effective treatment. I mean, there was some treatment involved in terms of maybe antidepressants, anti-anxiety drugs, and then cognitive behavioral therapy and uh, a variant of that like dialectical behavioral therapy. That can be somewhat effective, but somatization is something that either resolves spontaneously or is pervasive, but people can get through their daily lives with somatizations. It's not a wonderful life, but they get through it. Eating disorders is a different ballgame, though. I'm not sort of belittling somatization because I do research in that area and I think it's very important, but eating disorders are one of the most lethal psychological illnesses or diseases that one can have. Sometimes you try everything. You try medication, you try therapies, different therapies, you resort to hospitalization, and you still can't save the person. And I remember working within the insurance industry. I was doing mental health work for an insurance company, and we had many meetings with the vice presidents, and we had to talk about, we had basically rounds every day where we would go around and talk about different patients and what the treatment is and how much it's going to cost. And then we got to eating disorders, where we had to deal with people that were in the hospital for a prolonged period of time. And this was an extremely difficult topic to talk about because, from an insurance industry standpoint, these are the most problematic patients you could ever have because they're in the hospital for months at a time and it costs a lot of money. And from the insurance company standpoint, they want to get them out of the hospital. Well, that's very difficult because if the person refuses to eat and they have to be basically fed intravenously while in the hospital because they're going to die if they get released, that's going to cost a lot of money. It's going to be a lot of hospital, a very long hospital stay with eating disorder patients, and they cost a ton of money. And the insurance companies don't want to hear this. They want to minimize the amount of money they're spending. And so we're having a conversation about the best way to treat them. And one of the vice presidents tells me, well, you know that 20% of anorexics are going to die anyway, no matter what we do. So why are we going through all of this stuff and spending all this money when 20% of them are going to die anyway? And I just sat there kind of like, what? What are you talking about? So this is rationalizing not to treat these people because there's a proportion of them that's going to die no matter what you do. Now, that's a true statement. There is a proportion of eating disorder patients, especially those with anorexia nervosa, that are going to die no matter what you do. And it's very sad because these people are struggling for years upon years and they can't get over that hurdle. But that doesn't mean you rationalize it and say, let's not do anything. There are treatments. This is a difficult disorder to get through. Both bulimia and anorexia, obviously anorexia is much worse, are very difficult disorders to deal with, to treat. Um, and yes, some people are going to die from them, especially anorexia. But that doesn't mean we can't work at getting better treatments and we can't work at trying to improve people's lives. We can. Unfortunately, not everyone sees it this way. Some people have already, raised the white flag and said basically, I give up. There's nothing I can do here. That's not the case. Now, in Western society, this is playing a big role. So culture plays a large role in terms of defining eating disorders. In our Western society in which we live, um, thinness is equated with health and beauty. And in some circles, the belief that you can never be thin enough. Thin is beautiful. Fat is to be shamed, right? Even normal weight is to be shamed in some, among some people's beliefs. that you can never be thin enough, especially if you're female. Although that tendency or that belief has kind of migrated over to encompass men as well in certain fields. Thinness has become a national obsession, and this has led to the rise in eating disorder and the fear of fat, the fear of weight gain. And with that, over the last several decades, has increased the diagnoses of anorexia and bulimia. Now, what's causing the society to do this? TV, magazines, the internet, obviously. This is has a very big impact on adolescents, children growing up, and saying, I have to be this way, I have to be this weight, I have to be this thin in order to succeed, to be successful, to be loved, to get a good job, to be popular in school, etc. And it's gotten out of control. And we need to do something to stop this. We're not doing a good job of it right now. Anorexia is a devastating disorder that occurs when a person refuses to maintain more than 85% of their normal body weight. Now that's, BMI, body mass index. So if around 20, a BMI around 20 is average, they're on the very low end. So they're going down to like 17 and below. So we're talking about double digits in terms of weight, so under 100 pounds. And some anorexics will go down under 70 pounds, and they'll have to be hospitalized, and it's a constant struggle. They have an intense fear of becoming overweight and a very distorted view of weight and shape. So this is kind of related to a body dysmorphic disorder. So in body dysmorphic disorder, when someone looks at themselves in the mirror, they see a distorted part of their body that disgusts them. Whether that be their nose is gigantic, and in reality it's a normal sized nose, but they see it as being just exaggeratedly large and disgusting. Or certain facial features, their chin, or their face. Their face looks a lot fatter in the mirror than they think it looks. And they look at themselves and they look disgusting. So what they see in the mirror is not what reality is. And that's at the heart of anorexia. There is this cognitive distortion where a patient cannot accurately appraise themselves of how they look. Now you couple this with uh, harassment that occurs in all schools at an early age, where you have constant teasing and bullying. And although bullying has been addressed since Columbine, bullying's been addressed in schools, there's still bullying going on in terms of making fun of people's weights. And you couple that with someone that has a distorted view of themselves, right? And then you have, the bullying that occurs within schools that is not addressed because it's not physical, it's not hitting people. There's not physical bullying going on, it's emotional bullying. And that can lead to really dire consequences early in life. So anorexia starting during your teenage years. And some people will say it starts earlier. It starts when you're a child, when you're under 12. There's concerns about body image and weight, starting from a very, very early age. Another side effect or consequence of anorexia, very low body weight, leads to amenorrhea, which is basically cessation of menstruation. So a woman with anorexia will stop menstruating because the body kind of goes into full shutdown mode and says, I can't afford to expend any energy at all because there's not enough caloric content coming in. The body is starving. So it basically shuts down. One of the first things to shut down is menstruation. That's a waste of energy that I don't have. Now, eventually, if an anorexia goes down the wrong road, anorexic patient, I should say, goes down the wrong road, uh, their organs will start shutting down, and that's when death becomes very likely. So this has to be caught early and addressed, and there has to be societal change. And I've been saying this for years, and there hasn't been enough change. Things are still the same way. Our society still values very superficial traits like thinness in women. They're still bullying, emotional, psychological, in schools among young girls. Now, could it occur in men? It can, but it's very rare to occur in men. Most likely, men have a body dysmorphia disorder around their muscles. Their muscles aren't big enough. They're not as muscular as they want to be. They're too scrawny. So it's kind of not the same as anorexia, where the desire to get thin. It's more towards, looking at themselves in a distorted way with regard to their muscles. So anorexia is predominantly among women, although you do get some athletes like wrestlers who have to make weight, and they will end up with eating disordered behavior in order to get under a certain weight. But that's a very small percentage of all the cases of anorexia total. There are a couple of subtypes of anorexia. You have the restricting type, which is overwhelmingly the main type of anorexia, where you basically starve yourself. You also have a binge eating purging type, where the person will eat, but they will make sure they purge. And this is a little bit different than bulimia, because in bulimia, body weight is relatively normal or slightly above normal. In anorexia, body weight is really low, very far below normal. So the binge eating and purging type is less common in terms of anorexia, because people aren't really binge eating when they're anorexic. It can occur, but then it's followed by a tremendous amount of purging, like hours worth of exercise and then starvation after that. Most of the time, it's restricting. So I'm not going to eat anything today. I'm not going to eat anything tomorrow. I'm not going to eat anything the next day, right? So it's very low caloric intake. Sometimes reaching, 400 calories a day, 500 calories a day, which is absolutely disastrous. No one can live on such small amounts of calories. But that's what it can come down to in some cases. The typical case of anorexia is someone that's, regular, normal weight or maybe slightly overweight that decides to go on a diet. Uh, generally occurring in teenage females, right? Can start as early as young, children in even elementary school that talk about dieting, that start dieting, which is kind of a scary thing to think about. That children in elementary schools are thinking about dieting at this age. But the most typical case is a female teenager who then, is normal weight, maybe slightly above normal weight, and decides to go on a diet that just doesn't stop. It's like the never-ending diet. And even if they lose a lot of weight, they still look at themselves as being disgusting. And they still feel that they have to keep going. And there's really nothing to stop them. It can also follow a stressful event, such as separation of parents. A divorce is a very stressful event that can trigger anorexia. Or even, domestic violence within the household. Large amount of conflict within the household. Move away from home. So this can start with either a boarding school or college as well. Most of the times it starts earlier than college. There's some symptoms earlier than college, but it can really be triggered to a stressful event like moving away from college. Moving away for college, is to say. Experience of personal failure. Now that could be anything. That could be socially, that could be academically. That trigger could be any kind of, the person feels that they're not good enough. So there's a lot of low self-esteem involved. Most patients can recover with treatment. As I mentioned before, anorexia is a very difficult disorder to treat, but with persistent treatment, the majority of patients recover. However, there's always a small percentage of them that just don't. So they have to be hospitalized. They're in and out of the hospital. They're in the hospital for many months at a time because they refuse to eat. They have to be fed, force-fed intravenously in the hospital. And a small percentage of them die from either medical complications or they commit suicide because they feel they can't control their life. And that's the sad part is, how do we prevent this small, maybe 10%, can be even less than that, percentage of people with anorexia from dying? The clinical picture of anorexia is an overwhelming desire to be thin. There's a fear of fat, fear of becoming obese, fear of giving into the desire. I'm hungry, but I'm not going to eat because I'm afraid of getting fat or losing control of your body size and shape. And this is not just from a cognitive perspective. Yes, the person with anorexia sees themselves in a way that is not normal. They don't see what everybody else sees. They see themselves as disgusting. They see themselves as overweight, when in fact they're really thin. You may look at them and be so worried that something, they're suffering. We need to do something to treat this person with anorexia, whether it's a family member, whether it's a friend. You feel the need to sort of address it, but trying to get through to that person is almost impossible. You're so thin, you have to eat, you need to eat, please eat. And they're just like, I'm disgusting looking, I can't eat, I'm too fat, I need to get thinner. Or in fact, they've been getting thinner and thinner and thinner over months or years before that, to the point where now they're borderline hospitalization and they still feel they need to be thinner. And to convince them that this is a distortion, that's not easy to do. That's a very difficult task, to convince someone that the way you perceive yourself, the way you look at yourself, is a cognitive distortion. It's not reality. And so it's very difficult to treat. First off, it's very difficult to get anorexic patients to go to therapy, first off, because they like to hide their behavior. They don't want to be seen. They don't want anybody to know about it. So they'll wear baggy clothes to try to conceal them losing weight. They don't want to talk about it. They see themselves as disgusting. They don't want to be told, you need to eat more. That doesn't resonate with the anorexic patient. So getting them into treatment by itself is a hurdle sometimes, and then keeping them in treatment and keeping them out of the hospital is another hurdle that you have to deal with later on. Hopefully you can short circuit the the maladaptive cognition early on before the person gets dangerously thin and has to be hospitalized. Despite these dietary restrictions, people with anorexia are preoccupied with food. All they do is think about food, talk about food, dream about food, cook food for other people. It's gotten to that point, right? So their life revolves around food. Why? Because they're starving. If you're starving, all you can think about is food. And the anorexic patient is starving. And so their life revolves around food, but there's such overwhelming fear of getting fat that they don't dare touch the food and eat it. It could smell great. They could want to eat it, but they'll give it to somebody else. Their siblings, their parents, friends. They'll bake them cookies. They'll make, all kinds of things for other people, but they won't eat it themselves. But their life does revolve around food, and that's because they're starving. And when you're starving, this is the number one motivation, is to eat. And to sort of deal with that, to put that off, is very difficult. So there's a lot of obsessional thinking going on around food with the anorexic patient. They have plenty of cognitive distortion. They have a low self-esteem, low opinion of their body shape. They tend to see themselves as bigger than they usually are, as fatter than they actually are, right? That's a cognitive distortion. If they look in the mirror, they look disgusting. They look really overweight and heavy and obese. They may actually say that they're obese, and then you're looking at them and you just can't believe it. It doesn't make any sense to you. Their body weight is so low that they're at the borderline point of hospitalization, and they're telling you that they're obese. And they actually believe this. This is what they actually see. This is how they perceive themselves when they look at themselves. There's also a big push towards perfectionism. So patients with eating disorders, especially anorexia, tend to be very highly perfectionistic. And they feel that by starving themselves, by being this thin or getting thinner, that this is a positive quality. And they're going to be a better person because of this. And they're going to be more likable, have more friends, have better relationships, be more successful if they starve themselves. And they'll feel guilty if they start eating. So highly perfectionistic tend to be relatively good students, if not very good students in school. Right? So they're high achievers. They're not, slacking in any way. They want to do well. They want to be the best they can be. And part of this is being as thin as possible, even if it's very unrealistic, because they're actually very thin to begin with. There's no room to become thinner. And some psychological symptoms they display are depression, can be mild to moderate. It's not severe depression generally. Anxiety. Of course, the anxiety revolves around perception, body image, low self-esteem, insomnia, other sleep disorders, substance abuse. That's another way that people can diet is by, abusing drugs like cocaine or more commonly used now methamphetamine, where you go on a methamphetamine diet to starve yourself to lose weight. And so the anorexic patient will revert to any possible method to lose weight, including potent stimulants. Not just diet pills. Diet pills are, amphetamines, right? They're stimulants. They're bad in themselves. They're dangerous, under certain circumstances, diet pills. But we're talking about way up the line to methamphetamine, which is a magnitude of 10 or 20 times as strong as any diet pill. And as far as losing weight, people will lose a great deal of weight if they're using methamphetamine. And this meets the goal of the anorexic. So that's a big problem because it's very commonly available. Also, obsessive compulsive patterns. The whole, not dieting and stuff is, not eating, I should say, not dieting, not eating is related to this sort of obsessive compulsive behavior. And of course, I mentioned perfectionism. And the medical problems resulting from anorexia include amenorrhea, which is lack of menstruation, low body temperature, so always being cold, low blood pressure, body swelling, reduced bone density, which can lead to a higher incidence of osteoporosis later in life, slow or abnormal heart rhythm. In severe cases, they can have a severe arrhythmia due to starvation. They need to be hospitalized for that. Could actually die from that as well. Electrolyte imbalances, which can then trigger the abnormal heart rhythms. Dry skin, brittle nails, poor circulation, and something called lanugo, which is like these very fine, almost baby hairs that grow on their body, especially with very, very low body weight. It's almost a protective mechanism because the body is very cold. The low body weight, the body is very cold, it's disturbed, and so these patients will grow these fine, silky hairs on their body. almost like the body's trying to warm itself up because the body weight is so low and the body temperature drops. So that's Lanugo. Now let's switch tracks and talk a little bit about bulimia before I get to treatments. And bulimia is known as the binge purge syndrome. It's characterized by binges, which is uncontrolled eating during a limited period of time. So they're eating a vast amount of more food than a normal person could eat in that period of time. We're talking about 1,000 calories up to 10,000 calories in one sitting. Now, 1,000 calories, people could eat that. But 10,000 calories, that's like a whole table filled with food, all kinds of food. And it becomes almost like a mindless process during the binge, where the patient with bulimia that's binging will just put food, just one after another, shoving food in their mouth, and they'll be not even aware of what's going on. So they're not really experiencing the sensation, the pleasure that food can bring. It's almost just kind of a passive process where they're compelled to just keep eating, and they can't stop. So it's a really kind of passive attempt to just keep eating. And it can go up 10,000 calories. It's a lot of calories. Now, in the case of bulimics, if they're binging 10,000 calories or several thousand calories, then a profound amount of guilt comes with that territory, right? So the typical case is a normal to slightly overweight female that's been on dieting for years before this. So they're normal or above normal, and they generally stay normal or above normal in weight over the course of bulimia. So it's not that they're losing tremendous amounts of weight by purging. They're not. Anorexics are losing a tremendous amount of weight by starving themselves. But bulimics will eat. They'll do it secretly. They'll binge in secret. They won't tell anybody about it, but they'll eat. But once they binge, they feel guilty and they have to purge. Because they can't just, they realize, what have I done? I've been eating and eating and eating. I don't even know what I'm doing. It feels like it's out of their control. But they know they've basically ate everything. And they're afraid of gaining weight, once again. And so they result in purging. Predominantly occurs in females, just like anorexia. 90 to 95% of cases occur in females. Peak age is, once again, teenage years to early adulthood. And this can go on and on and on for many years, on and off. It's not as dangerous technically as anorexia. It's still dangerous. But anorexia is a far more dangerous disorder because it can lead to organ failure and death in, a reasonable percentage of people. Less than 10%, but up to 10%. It's a pretty big chunk of people that can die of anorexia. With bulimia, the death rate is much, much lower. Obviously, they're not starving themselves. They can get an electrical imbalance from constant vomiting. Laxative use can lead to electrolyte imbalance. It can lead to abnormal heart rhythm, which technically could kill them if they're not hospitalized and treated immediately in those cases. So there is a risk involved with bulimia, but that risk is much more tenuous or smaller compared to what anorexics face. And this could be a relapsing remitting kind of disorder where people go through periods of binging and then periods of fairly normal eating behavior and then go back into the binge cycle again, binge purge cycle. As I previously mentioned, bulimia is characterized by binging and purging, and that purging is mainly vomiting. So the binge will happen and then immediately followed by the purge, which is generally vomiting, although it can be laxatives, it can be diuretics, it can be enemas, but these are not effective purging mechanisms. The most effective one would be forced vomiting, so that's the one that's generally used. There's also a non-purging type of bulimia that is less common than the typical binge purging bulimia. And this non-purging type includes fasting, which is similar to anorexia, basically starving yourself. Except with anorexia, the fast never ends. This continues day after day and after day, especially starvation. With the bulimic, they're going to eat. They may fast for a period of time, but there's going to be normal, if not binge eating in the future. They can also utilize exercise as a way of purging. So they may binge and then they may exercise for hours at a time as a way to sort of make up for the binging. Once again, this is less common than the typical binge purge, but it does happen. People with bulimia are generally normal or above normal in weight. Um, they may eventually qualify for a diagnosis of anorexia over time. It's not guaranteed, but there are some patients that will go from bulimia, they'll go from dieting to then bulimia, then to anorexia. It does happen, or they can just stay bulimic. And there's something called binge eating disorder, which is a new disorder from the DSM-5, and this is related to bulimia, but binge eating disorder includes no purging. So it's basically binge eating without vomiting or any other compensatory mechanism. People with bulimia typically have between 1 and 30 binges a week. 30 is a lot of binges for a week. But there's multiple binge sessions occurring during the week. They're done secretly. They try to hide the behavior. They can be embarrassed by the behavior, people with bulimia. They will consume the food extremely rapidly with very little chewing. And the foods typically are foods with soft texture, sweet, high caloric foods, including baked goods, cakes, cookies, donuts, ice cream. They're not binging on, kale, right? There's no such thing as the kale binge. They're binging on things that are thousands and thousands of calories, fatty, sweet, starchy foods that can lead to weight gain, if not for the purging. And as previously mentioned, they can consume 10,000 calories in a binge episode, which is several days worth of food for people of normal weight. Binges are generally preceded by some kind of trigger, some kind of stressor that then triggers the binge. And as I said before, the binge is passive. So the person with bulimia will binge, but they really don't know exactly they're not really aware of what's going on. They're binging, but they're just basically shoving food in their mouth one after the other. They're not tasting the food. They're not experiencing it. It's not like a pleasure to them. It's just kind of a passive feeding frenzy, if you want to think of it that way. The binge itself generally temporarily pleasurable, but generally not. It's more of a period of helplessness, powerlessness. So the food itself may be good, may taste good, may trigger a certain reward property in the brain, like a dopamine release, that may be transiently pleasurable. But people with bulimia generally don't describe the binge as pleasurable. They feel extremely guilty and depressed, and they fear of getting of weight gain and being discovered. And so there's a profound guilt associated with the binge. So once the binge is finished, it's like, what have I done? So the transient nature of the food being pleasurable, I mean, we generally like things and we eat things that are pleasurable. We enjoy them. We like them. But the binge episode goes beyond that. It's not that they're savoring the food that they're eating. There may be some reward of eating this food, but that reward is very limited and it's very transient. It becomes almost like a passive process, and the person feels guilt upon consuming all this food. So there's nothing really overly pleasurable about the binge episode as a whole. Maybe temporarily pleasurable about eating things at the beginning of the binge episode. But that's quickly followed by this depression and disgust and fear of being discovered. And vomiting is the cure. That's the compensatory mechanism, vomit. And so there's a belief that by vomiting you can get rid of the calories. Well, yes and no. You get rid of some of the calories that way, but some of the food is already absorbed by the time you're vomiting. And so you're taking in some calories. It's not like you took in 0 calories if you purge right after you have the binge episode. That's not the case. You're still going to take in calories. It's just going to be less than what you ate. You're going to eliminate some of that because you're vomiting it up. It hasn't been digested yet. But some of the food has been partially digested, and therefore those nutrients have been absorbed. Those calories have been absorbed. Repeating vomiting affects the ability to feel full. So the more you purge, binge and purge, the more hungry you are, and therefore the more times you binge, and it becomes a vicious cycle. I'm hungry, I'm going to binge, I'm going to purge, that's going to make me more hungry, I'm going to binge again, I'm going to purge, that's going to make me even more hungry. And they feel trapped in this cycle. That's not even counting the destruction that the purging, the vomiting is doing to your body. I mean, the hydrochloric acid in your stomach is going to burn up your entire esophagus. You're going to have erosive esophagitis, which is basically burned esophagus. The epithelial cells lining your esophagus will be destroyed. You'll start coughing because you'll feel the worst kind of acid reflux you've ever felt if you keep purging over time, because you'll just feel acid coming up from your stomach constantly, and it's going to be burning your esophagus, it's going to be burning your mouth, it's going to lesion your esophagus. It can even be cancerous over time. It's dangerous. Plus, you're going to have severe electrolyte imbalance because you're going to be dehydrated from vomiting all the time. Purging dehydrates you. If you're prone to any kind of cardiac abnormality, you're going to have it. Can it be deadly? Of course. If you're predisposed to a deadly heart arrhythmia and you purge and you vomit and you're severely dehydrated, it's going to make you more likely to have an abnormal heart rhythm, which could be deadly in some cases. With laxatives and diuretics, you're going to become dehydrated to a degree, but you're not going to lose all the calories. So vomiting is the most effective way to lose the majority of calories consumed. Diuretics and laxatives, the food has already been digested. So what are you really losing? And diuretics just make you urinate more. So you're not really losing anything there. And laxatives will make you defecate more, but that's not going to lead to a significant amount of weight gain. It's going to be negligible. So the most effective way to purge would be vomiting, but once again, vomiting is associated with a variety of negative and dangerous health effects. Constant vomiting. So when I compare bulimia to anorexia, similarities are there's a period of dieting that generally starts. The dieting could go on for months or years before these disorders are triggered. There's a fear of becoming obese, a drive to become thin, preoccupation with food, weight, appearance, feelings of anxiety, depression, obsessive beliefs, right? Perfectionism, heightened risk of suicide, possible substance abuse, distorted body perception, and of course, distorted attitude or disturbed attitude towards eating. The differences are that people with bulimia are more concerned about pleasing others. So they're in it to make themselves more attractive to other people, to have intimate relationships. Whereas the anorexic doesn't really care about relationships. They're in the anorexic phase for themselves. Yes, they may feel bullying and stress from people at school, etc. But the thing that bothers them is not that they're having relationship problems. A lot of times they don't have relationships. They're just obsessing over their appearance to the point where they can starve themselves and die. Whereas bulimics tend to be more interested in doing this for relationship sake, to generate better relationships. They tend to be more sexually experienced and active. They tend to care more about these things than people with anorexia. They also have histories of mood swings, poor coping skills, more so than patients with anorexia. So they're both terrible disorders. Anorexia has a higher lethality than bulimia, but bulimia is still very dangerous and very disturbing. Bulimics also tend to have personality disorders, which are very long-standing, inflexible patterns of behavior that have gone on for years, if not decades, of a person's life. They tend to be diagnosed more with borderline personality disorder, which is a personality disorder that's characterized by extreme sensitivity to criticism, unstable mood, and extreme impulsivity. So these are people that they take every criticism, they really take it to heart. They're kind of over criticized, right? They feel like they've been completely rejected by even tepid criticisms, minor criticisms, right? And they tend to be more impulsive. That's where you're getting the purging from. That's an impulsive behavior. And borderline personality disorder, which we'll talk about at the end of the course, is notoriously difficult to treat, although it is treated somewhat effectively with dialectical behavioral therapy. But it's pervasive, it's quite common, and difficult to treat. And that makes bulimia also pervasive, common, and difficult to treat. With bulimia, women are less likely to experience amenorrhea, or the cessation of menstruation. With anorexia, this is almost every woman that experiences amenorrhea with anorexia. And people with bulimia can suffer nerve damage caused by purging, vomiting, and laxatives. Like I said, it can just destroy your esophagus, your throat, can lead to cancer, causes long-standing damage that you don't have in anorexia because you're not having the extreme purging typically. Laxatives are dangerous as well. They can really screw up your ability to have a normal bowel movement. So if you rely on laxatives all the time and you're going to the bathroom all the time, once you stop them, that's it. Your body no longer knows how to go to the bathroom. So it's going to really throw off your gastrointestinal normalcy if you're constantly taking laxatives. Binge eating disorder is a new disorder to the DSM-5 where people have binging episodes without the purging to compensate for the binging episodes. As a result, these people tend to be obese because they're binging and binging, eating all those calories, but then they're not purging. So they feel that they cannot deal with the binge. They can't stop the binge. So they're binging, and it's causing them extreme distress, and they feel guilty about it, but they just can't purge. They can't bring themselves to purge. Therefore, they can't be bulimic because they're not purging. And this has to be at least weekly over a period of 3 months. So they're not purging, and they're not doing like excessive exercise as a compensatory mechanism. They're just feeling guilty, depressed, and upset, and just kind of like going to sleep, right? So they'll binge eat. They'll feel, what did I do? How could I do this? They'll cry. They'll be upset. They'll be, brokenhearted. But there'll be no purging. There'll be no vomiting, no diuretics, no laxatives, no excessive exercise. They'll just kind of cry themselves to sleep, and then that pattern will repeat itself either the next day or the day after, etc. So obesity is an effect of this because they're just consuming so many calories. Now, looking at the etiology or the cause of eating disorders, we can start with the psychodynamic perspective, which talks about ego deficiencies. So Hildebruck, which is she was a very well-known German psychoanalyst going back to the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, right? She passed away, I think, in the 80s. She argues that parents may respond to their children either effectively or ineffectively. So effective parents address their children's biological and emotional needs. Ineffective parents fail to attend to their children's needs, so they feed their children when their child is anxious, comfort them when they're tired. So they're all just mixed up. So they really can't identify the child's needs and then attend to it properly. As a result, their children grow up confused and unaware of their own internal needs, and they turn instead to external guides. Right? So if a child is anxious and needs to be comforted by his or her parent, and the parent doesn't know they're anxious, or doesn't care that they're anxious, or the parent is not even there, right? It's not around. The child becomes distressed, and the child learns to substitute other things, external factors, to deal with these emotions. So a child learns that when I feel anxious, um, I should eat something. And then you get that stress eating phenomenon, where some people regulate their emotions through eating. And then this can lead to binging and then guilt and purging, which is bulimia. It can lead to someone becoming overweight and then going to excessively diet to the point where their body weight's very low. They put themselves in physical danger, and that's anorexia. Or it can lead to binge disorder, where someone has an emotional problem and they just counteract it with binging food. And food is a very common regulator of emotions. But in some people with eating disorders, it can be out of control. There can be constant eating to deal with emotions they don't want to deal with, stress they don't want to deal with. So it's a poor coping mechanism. Instead of going and doing some exercise or getting some social support from friends or family, they turn to food as a way to regulate emotions. And there's some evidence to support this. It makes sense that early in life the child's trying to form a healthy attachment with the parent, and if they don't form that healthy attachment with the parent, they can substitute food in some way as a coping mechanism. And that carries with throughout to adulthood. There are also several cognitive factors that can contribute to this phenomenon where you label emotions or feelings, physiological sensations in your body improperly. So, you feel like your heart's racing, and the last time you remembered your heart racing, you did something pleasurable, you went out and you got an ice cream cone. And that made you feel better. So now you've conditioned this response. So you feel this way, and then right away you're like, I need ice cream. This happens all the time. Someone's upset, I need ice cream. Now, personally, I don't really understand this because I don't like ice cream at all. I would never say I'm upset I need ice cream, but I hear this constantly. I'm upset I need ice cream. I had a breakup in my relationship, so I'm going to sit inside, watch TV, and have you know buckets and buckets of ice cream to make myself feel better. It's the power of ice cream, right? It's or whatever your favorite junk food or comfort food is. You use it to deal with these negative emotions that you can't cope with, and if you've done it in the past, if it worked for you in the past, then it's probably going to work for you in the future. So if you've been stress eating and comfort eating early in life, you're going to bring it with you later in life. If you go on the internet, you also see these dark internet sites. They're called the pro-ana websites or pro-anorexia websites. So there are some sites called Dying to Be Thin, Starving for Perfection, where the people on these websites promote thinness, pathological thinness. They're basically promoting anorexia and saying that, you're going to be better if you look like this. And it almost becomes like a competition. Like, okay, this is the weekly challenge. Whoever loses 10 pounds or 8 pounds this week wins the weekly challenge. And this is not helping the treatment of anorexia, is when you have these websites that teenagers can then turn to and see other people glorifying anorexic behavior and giving challenges and making it like a competition and giving rewards for winning the competition. This is rewarding deadly behavior. And due to the idea that the website should be not monitored and everything should be free and no one should be tracked, Google and all these other companies, they haven't really got in there and basically eliminated these websites that are causing considerable harm. I don't know if they're worried about legal concerns, but some of these websites should not be allowed to exist because they're encouraging destructive and deadly behavior. If you look at biological factors, you have twin studies that show that identical twins are 70% likely to both have anorexia. So in other words, if one person has anorexia, if one twin has anorexia, then their identical twin has a 70% chance of also having anorexia, which is astronomically higher. So that shows you there's a gigantic genetic contribution to anorexia. When you drop this to fraternal twins, which share only 50% of their DNA, so they're like siblings, this drops all the way down to 20% for anorexia. So identical twins that share 100% of their DNA are 3.5 times as likely than fraternal twins who only share 50% of their DNA to develop anorexia. And that's if they're reared apart. This doesn't mean they're reared together. They could be reared apart and they still have a very high likelihood of getting anorexia. That's really, wow, that's a huge number. If you look at bulimia, it's much less pronounced. It's about 2.5 times identical twins compared to fraternal twins. But for anorexia, it's 3.5 times the rate, which is a very high number. These findings can be related to low serotonin. So there's some evidence that people with deficiency of serotonin are more prone to developing these eating disorders. Obviously, serotonin is correlated with a lot of things. It's correlated with mood, it's correlated with hunger, anxiety, sleep, sexual behavior. There's a lot of things that serotonin is related to. So I don't know how much, in terms of what kind of strong conclusion you can draw from this. But there is a correlation between low serotonin and the development of eating disorders. If you look at other biological models, they talk about the dysfunction of the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is a brain structure that regulates body temperature. It also regulates hunger. It also controls the entire endocrine system that we talked about previously with the fight or flight response. Now, researchers have been doing analysis on different parts of the hypothalamus involved in eating. One is called the lateral hypothalamus, which is towards the outside, the lateral part, the sides of the hypothalamus. And the ventral medial hypothalamus is the middle part of the hypothalamus. What they have found is that if you stimulate the lateral hypothalamus, you induce hunger and the organism eats more. If you stimulate the ventral medial hypothalamus, you decrease hunger and the organism eats much less. That's stimulation. So if you destroy the lateral hypothalamus, guess what happens? You destroy hunger and the organism becomes anorexic. And if you destroy the ventral medial hypothalamus, you destroy the satiety mechanism, the sort of being full. And so the organism keeps eating and eating and eating to the point where they become extremely obese. And they've done these studies in mice, and when they destroy the lateral hypothalamus, the mouse becomes anorexic. When they destroy the ventral medial hypothalamus, the mouse becomes gigantic. It becomes basically 3 times its normal size. This big, obese, fat mouse that can't stop eating. And so are these brain mechanisms at fault for anorexia and bulimia and binge eating? The answer is it's complicated. And even if they were contributing, it would be too dangerous to go into the human brain and just target these brain areas. Because remember, the hypothalamus not only controls eating, it controls sexual behavior, it controls body temperature, it also controls the endocrine system. So if you're targeting an area of the hypothalamus and you screw up body temperature, uh, sexual activity, right, endocrine system, if you screw that up as a side effect, these are devastating side effects. You can kill somebody. If you mess up the ability of the hypothalamus to regulate body temperature, the person dies. So I think this is the reason why there hasn't been targeted drug therapy towards the hypothalamus in terms of treating eating disorders. I think it's just too dangerous because there's too much going on there that's vital for survival. And researchers they can mess around with this in mice who they're going to kill anyway, unfortunately. But you can't do this in humans, because if you kill a human being, there's going to be a lawsuit, there's going to be uproar, it's going to be the end of the drug, right? So there hasn't been much progress in terms of human pharmacotherapy for the hypothalamus. Maybe there'll be some gene therapy work, but we're way away from that right now. There's also societal pressure contributing to eating disorders. As I mentioned previously, that the Western ideal is thin. The thin ideal, especially in women. And this has been trending this way for decades. So if you go back into the 50s and 60s, the thin ideal wasn't as ideal as it's become now. Now, if you look at magazine covers, you mostly see thin women. If you look at models, they're becoming thinner and thinner by the year, to the point where they're having severe problems with eating disorders, and multiple models have died. International models have died from anorexia. One piece of evidence is looking at the Miss America contest, which obviously uh, I'm not a big fan of. I don't know how you feel about it, but beauty pageants need to kind of go. This is really antiquated, but they still have beauty pageants, unfortunately. And if you look at Miss American contestants, they have declined in weight by 0.28 pounds a year. And the winners have declined in weight even more. So, it's not a contest that is decided by your ability to solve poverty or world hunger. The Miss America contest has always been derived based on what? They have the infamous category, the swimsuit category, right? And the ball gown category. And of course, there was one category, if I remember correctly, where they asked them a question about something about the world, and they give some generally not satisfying answer to. So the way these beauty pageants have been judged is based on beauty, not based on talent or intellect, but based on beauty. And who would think that these things would exist in this country today? But then again, you think of who our president is. Hopefully, was in the past and shortly. And you see that he was involved in all these beauty pageants. Yeah, this is kind of an ideal from a bygone era that should be really rejected by now. But there's been a decrease in the weight of these contestants over the years. emphasizing that people rate thinness as more beautiful. Still, into 2019, 2020, and beyond. Playboy centerfolds also have lower average weight, bust, and hip measurements than in the past. I'm not quite sure how anyone really recognizes this because I thought people read Playboys for the articles. Now, if you look at in terms of socioeconomic status affecting the diagnosis of eating disorders, women of higher socioeconomic status express more concerns with thinness and dieting in the past. So they've always referred to eating disorders, especially anorexia, as belonging to rich white girls. That was the predominant belief. That anorexia is predominantly a rich white girl, probably well-educated disorder. However, there has been increasing rates of eating disorder both within African American population, within the Asian American population, and the Hispanic American population. And so they're catching up. So it's no longer just a rich white girl disorder, right? It's becoming a disorder for basically everybody. And these minority communities have kind of insulated themselves for many years against this kind of pursuit for pathological thinness. But now they're kind of going with it, right? They're no longer the ideal of beauty is going towards thinness in these communities where it was never really going in that direction before. So that has been changing over the years, and it's becoming more that everybody's involved in trying to be, as thin as possible, which is dangerous and is not necessary. I mean, it's really sad to think that our society has these views today. That there's not, we haven't come up with a more evolved stance on what we consider beautiful and attractive and worthy, other than, what the media depicts. But then again, as I said in class many times, the vast majority of people in the world are stupid. And as the media keeps blitzing them with this is the way, this is this magazine, and this is this TV show, and this is how everybody is, then they're setting the stage for this kind of belief that thinness is equality, thinness equals beauty equals goodness. There is still a prejudice against overweight people in the country. Whether that prejudice comes from the media, it could also come from the health community, where people talk about how if you're overweight, you're more likely to have health problems, diseases, right? And then you're more prone to illness in the future. Well, that's true, but that's almost kind of a sort of a rationalizing discrimination. So you don't want to say that overweight people are inferior. They might believe this, but instead, I've heard some medical doctors couch it in the terms that overweight people are making themselves more prone to illness and death at an earlier age, sort of implying that this is a bad way to live and that's controllable. And the research is mixed about that. Yes, there is a part of weight that people can control, and there's also a large genetic component that's really out of the person's control. So it's under control within reason. But there's people still think that overweight people are somewhat inferior, lazy, they can't control their eating patterns, etc. And that's not necessarily the case. So this fear of fat and fear of becoming overweight and fear of being prejudiced against, etc., is occurring very early, elementary school. 50% of elementary school students and 61% of middle school girls are currently dieting. That's scary. That's very, very scary. Dieting in elementary school is just unreal. and a disaster. Something that needs to be changed. Because you can't be dieting when you're 10 years old. And of course, technology is playing a role, social networking, internet activities, posting your videos onto Instagram or what people use now, TikTok videos, and all these things, right, where appearance is key because you're putting yourself out on social media everywhere. You're posting pictures everywhere. So this kind of, the way society has become like a social media driven society can make this eating disorder problem, can exacerbate it. Because, you know, now you're posting pictures and videos, you're expected to do this all the time if you're younger. And if you don't do this, you're going to have problems with, you know, making social contacts, friends, etc. So there's more of a pressure there to be a certain way, to look a certain way. And then family plays a role. Of course, family plays a role in everything. With eating disorders, the family is very important. So half of the families of people with eating disorders have a long history of emphasizing thinness, appearance, and dieting. So the family is pushing this perfectionistic view on themselves, especially if the mother is dieting all the time. The mother is overly perfectionistic. And now her daughters are going to see this, and they're going to respond. And they're going to imitate because their role model is doing this. Their role model is afraid of gaining weight. Their role model is constantly dieting. So it becomes almost a normal behavior in the house. Their role model, their mother, expects them to do this X, Y, and Z things, to look a certain way, to have a certain number of friends, to have a certain number of extracurricular activities, putting pressure on that child to be a good student. So there's a very high degree of perfectionism within the family itself, and that's influencing the children to put them on this path toward eating disorders. There's also a abnormal pattern of communication within most of these families called enmeshment, or the enmeshed family patterns. So enmeshed family patterns or enmeshment. This basically means in the family there are no barriers, there are no boundaries. Everybody is involved in everybody's life. You know, my parents are my best friends, sort of thing. There's definitely, in that situation, there's definitely no boundaries. It's a boundary problem. You know, parents should give their children privacy with regards to certain things. They shouldn't be involved in everything their children are involved in. Some parents are overly involved, or they're overprotective. And this can lead to eating disorder. It can lead to codependency, where the child feels that, you know, they're dependent on the parent, and the parent feels that they're dependent on the child for some other, you know, process of attention, or vicariously living their life through their children. It's very unhealthy. So this enmeshed family pattern that was talked about by the family theorist Salvador Minuchin is something that needs to be broken. So family therapy is very important in treating eating disorders. It's actually probably the most important, the most effective kind of therapy overall. Is family, because family is triggering perfectionism. It's triggering the no boundaries, the over-involvement, and that's indirectly triggering the child to go down the path of the eating disorder. So family dynamics need to be examined, need to be changed through family therapy, which is very, very important. In the African American community, there was more of a positive view of body image going back several decades. So if you go back to the 90s, African American women had a much more positive body image than those of young white American women. However, over time, this is kind of evened up. So now in the African American community, there's still a big push towards thinness, much more than there was going back several decades. Eating disorders among Hispanic Americans has also become relatively equal to white Americans. And this is happening also among young Asian American. So it's become a global pattern of pushing towards thinness. And with that becomes eating disorder, being dissatisfied with body image, having low self-esteem. This is a global issue now. It was once a rich white American predominantly disorder. Now it's become a global disorder among women, eating disorders. It's become very difficult to treat. It's on the rise when it should be attenuated by now. We haven't figured this out. How do we change the world, the way what the world sees as beautiful, what the world is seeing as attractive? I mean, is it we have to change the media? We have to control the media? Because that's never going to happen here. Is that the only way to do it? I mean, I know there's mention and there's a push in some places to feature normal-looking women instead of emaciated-looking models selling, products, clothing, etc. Right? So maybe have a normal-sized woman selling clothes, suggesting that you don't have to be an emaciated model. You don't have to look like this. Why would you want to look like this? Why do you consider that attractive? Is it because the media says it's attractive? So there's a lot of societal issues that need to be ironed out. And they haven't been ironed out yet. This has been going on. It's been getting worse over the years. But there has to be more of a drive to show that there is a vast majority of people find anorexic women to not be ideal, not to be attractive. And, to the point where you're killing yourself. Why are you killing yourself? Are you doing it for yourself, the distortion in your head? Are you doing it from your family that's been very pressuring you and been in your business about everything? Are you doing it for a relationship or a potential relationship? So as a society, we need to be more open-minded about this stuff. We need to be more diverse with regard to weight, with regard to what is considered ideal. There is more than one ideal, but our society hasn't gone in that direction. Well, the vast majority of our society hasn't. We've paid lip service to it, but we haven't made the changes that need to be made. And until we do, there's going to be increasing eating disorders and increasing death. Unfortunately, people have different priorities. It's sad to see that. As mentioned, males only account for a very small percentage, 5 to 10% of all eating disorders. And this could be due to a double standard in society for attractiveness, where society is telling women to look a certain way, but they're not necessarily telling men to look the same way. Although things have been changing slowly in that regard, right? But it hasn't evened out at all. There's also the idea that men are more interested in exercising and looking muscular, and so therefore they're not going to starve themselves or eat erratically in this way. But they can be very obsessed about exercise. They can be obsessed about their look in terms of muscularity. They can almost develop a cognitive distortion about how they look, that they don't look muscular enough. So men are more likely to exercise, women may be more likely to diet, just because of the different views of muscle mass. That men they feel that they have to be more muscular, whereas women feel they have to be thinner. So this is not causing men to die from this behavior. So it's a much more lethal force within young women than within men. But it is disturbing to men who feel this way, that they feel they're not muscular enough, or they have to do more, they're not good enough the way they look. That can be disturbing too. That's something that needs to be looked at as well. But right now, the focus is on how do we stop anorexia and bulimia, which is a predominantly female disorder. So treating includes correcting dangerous eating patterns and addressing the psychological and situational factors that maintain the eating problem. That involves the family. That involves the cognitive distortions from the person that's suffering from the disorder. That involves society, culture. There's a lot of things you can't really control culture too much, but you can control family interactions, goals, cognitive distortions that the person's having. You can treat all those things. Biologically, not sure what you can really do. Uh, there's some talk about experimental treatment with antidepressants that lead to weight gain for anorexic patients. But once again, they're probably not going to take these pills. So I don't know how you really force them unless you give them some in the hospital. So it's a very difficult situation. But family therapy is number one, and then some kind of cognitive therapy to address those distortions could also be very useful. The goals for anorexia treatment include regaining lost weight, recovering from malnourishment, and eating normally again. So lost weight is the number one thing, especially if they're in a hospital. You have to get their weight up above a certain point before they can be discharged. And the anorexic person in the hospital is saying most of the time, I don't want to leave because I'm afraid if I get discharged, I'm going to die of anorexia. I can't control it. The safest place for me to be is in the hospital. Now, that's kind of crazy thinking about it, but in many cases, that's the truth. In many cases, severe anorexic patient goes to the hospital for many months. Finally, their weight gets up to a certain point, they're discharged, and they fall apart and they end up dead. So the goal transitioning is, do you have a good discharge plan for the anorexic patient in the hospital? Do you have support services that are going to contact them and constantly follow up with them? Make sure they're on the right path. You can't just drop them once they get out of the hospital because those patients are going to end up dead, some of them. So you have to really have good discharge planning coming out of the hospital with the anorexic patient. So as I said before, saying it again, first goal is to get weight on these patients. High calorie diet, nutritional counseling, psychological counseling, all of this is involved. They need to eat more. That's the only way they're going to get out of the danger zone, is to basically force feed, eat more. This takes a couple of months if you're successful with this. In order to keep the weight on, their cognitive distortions, their psychological problems, their family issues need to all be worked out. Otherwise, they're going to relapse. They're going to end up back in the hospital or dead. So this is a long-term project. It's not over in a couple of months. This is a lifelong issue. The first few years trying to recover are the most important. Can you get through that? Can you keep the weight on for those first few months to years? Once you do that, you're on your way. I mean, it's a lifelong issue, but you're on your way. If you can't get through those first few months to a year and you're relapsing, now the prognosis isn't as kind. Now it's a much worse prognosis. You have a higher chance of dying from it. Therapists need to teach their patients with anorexia independence and control. Independence from the family is very important. Control over their life, a sense of control over their life. They need to validate these internal feelings, these negative cognitions they have about themselves, that they're not good enough, that they're obese when they're not, these distortions. They need to also change their attitudes about eating and weight. So you can eat healthy and not gain, a tremendous amount of weight, if any weight. You can be a healthy weight and be happy in life. You don't have to be anorexic to be happy or to have a successful relationship or marriage or to be successful in life in any way you want. That has to be changed. Family therapy comes back again. Extremely important. And if you have a good family therapist, this can make all the difference in the world. And that's why I tell students that if you're looking to be a therapist and you try out family therapy and you're good at this is a very good career because people will pay you your weight in gold if you're a good family therapist. Not only to save their marriage, but to deal with problems like this with their children. There is a demand for really good family therapists out there. There's not a lot of really good family therapists, to be honest with you. Some of them are okay, and some of them are just bad. It's like any other career, right? There is a demand for a good family therapist. So if you're good working with other people and you're working with groups, then family therapy could be a career that you want to go into and you get your license in marital and family therapy. So this goes back to addressing attachment-related issues. Your attachment, starting with your parents early in life. That may need to be resolved because that dictates what your attachment is later in life to other people that you have significant relationships to. And then boundary issues. How do you set healthy boundaries? Starting with your family, your immediate family. Positive treatments, if you respond to therapy and you really work hard at it, about 90% of patients will show improvements after months to years. This is not just about gaining weight. So you gain the weight back, you're not done. It's about changing your view of the world, your view of yourself, your cognitive distortions, your interactions with loved ones, family members, boundary issues. There's a lot going on here that needs to be resolved. Menstruation will return when you return to your normal weight. The death rate of anorexia nervosa is declining, although it's still high. The negatives of treatment is, in a quarter of these people with anorexia, it just doesn't work. They still have problems over and over again. It's a constant struggle. It's like a roller coaster of doing better, doing worse, doing better, doing worse. And there's going to be a proportion of people treated for anorexia that won't make it. And they're going to pass on. They're just not going to be able to, their body will shut down, their organs will fail, they're going to die. And there's a small percentage, less than 10%, that fall into this category. So it's a long process, but it's something that you can get through, that you can get your patients through. But there's always going to be some patients that don't make it. No matter what you do as a therapist, it doesn't mean you failed. It just means you did your best. This was a patient that just couldn't resolve. As a therapist, you cannot blame yourself for patients failing or patients not improving. Or if you had a patient that ended up, dying from anorexia, this is not the therapist's fault. This is something that is a normal part of anorexia, that we're trying to reduce the deaths, but they're still out there. Lingering emotional problems can be common among survivors. This could be a lifelong issue. So there's ways to improve, there's ways to get better, but there's always people that don't improve the way you would want them to improve for a variety of reasons. They're not making the changes. They're unsuccessful with the family, altering the family dynamics, etc. For bulimia, it's a lot easier. I'm not saying in order to get rid of bulimia, but you're not faced with a life or death situation like you are with anorexia. So with bulimia, you want to eliminate binge purge patterns, establish healthy eating habits, and look at the etiology of the bulimic symptoms and try to target that. So there's a lot of psychoeducation involved here, and then there's therapy, and once again, there's also family issues here, and cognitive distortions and low self-esteem, so all that has to be addressed as well. But this is a lot less tricky than dealing with anorexia. Is just horrible. It's a very difficult disorder, and it can be deadly, and that's the problem. Is anorexics are in the hospital, they're out of the hospital, they're back in the hospital, and it's tough. It's a very tough disorder. Bulimia is a problematic disorder that can interfere socially, psychologically, causes occupational problems, but it's something that can be treated and is not as lethal. Cognitive behavioral therapy, very important, just like it is with in anorexia. But in this case, instead of just changing maladaptive cognitions, you want to break the binge purge cycle. So you have to use something like exposure and response prevention, which is what we used for obsessive compulsive disorder. So what the exposure is, they ate something or they binged. The response prevention is to not vomit or not purge now. Okay, you binge, you ate something. It's okay. It's okay. You don't need to purge. So you're trying to separate the binge from the purge. And if they could just get to the binge, eventually you can then work on decreasing the frequency of the binging. But you want to break the cycle of binge purge first. And the best way to do it is exposure and response prevention, just like you're treating obsessive compulsive disorder. And of course, you want to change their maladaptive cognitions towards food, towards their weight. You want them to challenge their negative thought process with regard to binging. So what's making you want to binge? What's triggering you? And is there something we can do when you have that trigger to binge? Can we change it and make it a more adaptive response? So maybe it's meditation, maybe it's exercise, maybe it's journaling, maybe it's something else. Maybe it's calling a friend. So you have this sort of feeling like you're out of control, like you're about to binge, and can you stop it and then make it a more adaptive process? That's the goal. Left untreated, bulimia can be a lifelong disorder. If treated, about 40% get significant improvement in the short term. An additional 40% of all bulimics get moderate improvement. So this is a much better prognosis than anorexia. Because with anorexia, you have a certain percentage of people that are going to die. With bulimia, that's not the case. You have the vast majority of people recovering or at least partially recovering. And so a much better outcome for bulimia than anorexia. Relapse, of course, is a problem, just like it is with anorexia, triggered by stressors. Also, if you had a longer history of binging and purging, or if you vomit more frequently, if you have substance abuse issues, or interpersonal difficulties. So all these things should be addressed, especially the substance abuse problem that needs to be addressed separately to keep these triggers of relapse in place. But the outlook for bulimia is pretty good overall. Finally, we want to utilize cognitive behavioral therapy. We want to eliminate the distorted thinking for binge eating disorder. So you're treating it the same way that you're treating bulimia, except that you're just focused on the triggers. So you're not focused on exposure or response prevention because there's no purging. So you're just focused on what is the trigger for binging. Could be as simple as anxiety. So when I have high levels of anxiety, that triggers the binging, and I'm using food to cope with my anxiety. If that's the case, antidepressants, anti-anxiety drugs, and cognitive behavioral therapy can help you identify, I'm anxious, I want to binge, stop, and go back and use an alternative strategy. It could be that you binge because you don't like the way you are, right? You have low self-esteem, you feel inferior in some way, and you're coping with this by binging. So it doesn't have to always be a mood issue. It could be a cognitive issue as well. But the idea is to find the trigger, work on the trigger, and stop the behavior. And this, of course, is the probably easiest thing to stop is just binge eating disorder, because you don't have to worry about the purging, you don't have to worry about the long-term damage from purging, which can happen, physiological damage, psychological damage from purging as well. This is just stopping the trigger. So there is a subset of obese patients who have binge eating disorder, and they're stress eating, or this is a trigger for eating, and you need to identify that trigger and then utilize an effective strategy to cope. So this is something that is not easy to treat, but it's the easiest of the three, anorexia, bulimia, and binge eating disorder to treat. And so that's it for this week's lesson. Hope you enjoyed it. It's a very interesting subject, of course. And I'll see you for the next lesson soon. Stay safe.